NK News has launched a new app that makes staying updated on all things North Korea easier than ever. The app gives access to the latest articles so you'll never miss a breaking story. It's fast, convenient, and designed with readers in mind. Our team is dedicated to bringing you the most accurate and insightful information about North Korea with content and analysis unavailable elsewhere. Don't delay. Download the NK News app from Apple's App Store or Google Play and stay connected with the latest North Korea news and analysis. The app also works with NK Pro subscriptions, offering full access to NK Pro content. Hello listeners and welcome to the NK News Roundtable Month in Review podcast recorded on Tuesday, November 14th here in the NK News Situation Room, as I like to call it. Hat tip to Wolf Blitzer. Welcome to my colleagues Alannah Hill, James Fretwell and Yifang Bremer. Welcome back on the show, and Alannah, in your case, welcome for the first proper roundtable, though you were on episode 300 briefly.
I did, yeah. I had a short interview, but this is my first time sitting down for a roundtable.
This is your first starring role. You've had a cameo. Yeah. Now we're going to try out a new format for this month's roundtable. The three of you have chosen three themes that have kept you busy this last month, I should say. And we're going to talk about those themes and refer to stories that deal with them. So let's start with James. James, you put together the month in review for October, didn't you?
I did indeed.
One of your usual tasks here at NK News and NK Pro. Tell us what theme stood out for you in the month in review.
Well, this theme is an ongoing theme that's been going on for a few months, and it's the really big one that's dominating not just the North Korea world, but also just it's having a big impact on world news in general, and that is, of course, North Korea's alleged weapons transfers to Russia and what it might be potentially receiving in return. That could be, it's speculated that North Korea might be getting help with its rockets. It might, even getting help with its nuclear weapons, or providing Russia with ammunition that it is supposedly going to use to aid its invasion of Ukraine.
Now, I've got to pick you up on the use of the word alleged. You said alleged weapons exports to Russia. Why are we still using the word alleged 2 months into this story?
Well, that's because I'm very careful by nature, I suppose. A lot of the US has reported on North Korean weapons transfers to Russia on a couple of occasions over the last few months now. It seems pretty likely, but we've not had any really 100% firm, hard evidence quite yet that Russia is using North Korean weapons.
What you mean to say is we haven't yet found the smoking gun or the smoking missile launch tube yet.
Right. So the US has released satellite imagery of containers being shipped. It showed the routes that it says these containers are going on, all the way from Russia's Far East to near the Ukrainian border. There haven't been any pictures of what's inside these containers as far as I know. I think the biggest media outlet to report on North Korean weapons in the war in Ukraine actually thus far has been the Financial Times. And that was actually North Korean weapons that ended up in Ukrainian hands, interestingly, actually. I think the story was about the Ukrainian forces actually managed to intercept a North Korean weapons delivery, and they thought, you know what, we'll use these, we'll take these for ourselves. So going forward,
a case of Russia shooting itself in the foot.
I suppose so. In that instance, yeah.
But going back to your photos, you mentioned photos. There was a bit of a confusion. We reported here at NK News. I think our colleague Anton, who unfortunately is not in the room with us, that some of the photos seem to show crates being imported from Russia, not going to Russia. Have I remembered that correctly?
So first of all, the US, they came out with this big announcement. They were showing satellite imagery of containers going from North Korea to Russia. Mm-hmm. That seems to be, as I understand it, all okay, consistent with our reporting. The report that I think that we were disputing, there was satellite analysis by another outlet that was picking up on containers that were piling up at a rail station near the border with Russia,
So
saying
in North Korea.
Right, yeah, and saying that these could be weapons shipments. But a couple of months ago, NK Pro, we got exclusive on-the-ground photos from near this area, and looking at the writing that was on the buildings in Korean, it seems that this area is used for disinfecting imports. So if they were weapons exports, maybe North Korea wouldn't be so worried about going through the whole disinfection process. They might actually, in fact, be imports from Russia in that case. But that doesn't mean that what the US is saying is incorrect. It does seem that North Korea is exporting large amounts of ammunition to Russia.
Well, I think by now we have seen actually Russian troops also using North Korean weapons in Ukraine. I mean, it's still a lot of open source evidence. So basically, troops who are fighting in Ukraine or are stationed near the border of Ukraine, Russian troops, who will upload some kind of makeshift footage of where they're fighting. And we are slowly seeing more and more weapons that look like at least North Korean, for example, 122 millimeter rockets, and also common artillery ammunition. So again, very difficult to verify, but more and more footage is appearing on, for example, Twitter, Telegram, of Russian troops with at least what looks like North Korean ammunition. So I think that's the thing that we've all been on the lookout for so long, because as James said, all we had before was just these vague satellite imagery of trains which basically could be carrying anything. By now, we understand that it's more likely that a lot of the ammunition will come through ship, actually.
Which is a long way to go. It seems inefficient.
It seems inefficient, but perhaps you can put more containers on a ship than on a train, right? And if these are really the gigantic shipments that it seems to be, then it would be actually perhaps more efficient to do it on a
But that seems to
ship.
allow the path open for interdiction. Remember the Proliferation Security Initiative that was started under George W. Bush about 20 years ago, and that was all about stopping North Korean ships on the high seas that were suspected of, not necessarily proven to have, but suspected of transporting rocket or nuclear technology, and whether, I don't know whether that's still something that can happen, but Proliferation Security Initiative was exactly designed to stop that kind of thing.
And that has happened, right? We've seen a lot of these shipments appear in the panel of expert reports, but that's been a couple of years ago by now. And then you have to imagine these ships are going from a port in North Korea through first North Korean territorial waters,
right?
Then perhaps a slight bit of international waters, I'm not quite sure, quite quickly entering Russian waters. So it would be definitely an extremely risky area to intercept any shipments, I can imagine.
I'm no weapons smuggler myself.
This is not a part of your past that we
it's on my resume. But I also would wonder how much easier it is to maybe ship things like this in container ships. Anton and Colin did a really interesting piece looking at satellite imagery and some shipping tracker data, and found that maybe Russia and North Korea are using very similar ships and like kind of look-alike ships and switching those out. So yeah.
Right. So my understanding is it's three basic things that we're looking at. We're looking at bullets, mortars, and some kind of rockets. That's more or less it?
That's what we are most certain of right now.
Right.
Though there is speculation that also more advanced North Korean weaponry, more advanced like ballistic, short-range ballistic missiles could be of interest to Russia because they're so similar to the short-range ballistic missiles that Russia is already using.
Right. Okay. Now, North Korea then, in return, instead of money, or perhaps in addition to money, is supposed to be getting some technological assistance. I'm thinking about, would they be perhaps getting multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, also known as MIRVs? Is that something that North Korea might be getting from Russia to help it put multiple warheads onto one rocket to send, to the United States in the event of a war, for example?
Well, I think there's been a lot of speculation on what North Korea might be receiving in return. This has ranged from technology for even nuclear-powered submarines. It seems that, I suppose, maybe the most likely is assistance with launching North Korean satellites, because that's what Russian President Vladimir Putin kind of alluded to when Kim Jong-un was visiting the country. It's again another one of these cases that we're going to have to wait and see. But, the downside for Russia in providing certain elements of military technology to North Korea is actually once you hand it over to the North Koreans, now it might seem like a good idea in the moment, but in the future you don't actually know where some of this stuff might end up. North Korea could sell it on. So Russia might be a little bit cautious about exporting some of the most advanced military technology. But perhaps something to do with North Korean rockets and satellites.
It's interesting that you're suggesting that Russia might be cautious because of where those weapons systems or rocket systems may end up in the future, but it doesn't seem that Russia is particularly careful about violating a United Nations Security Council resolution that it itself signed on to, and I looked it up last night. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1718 or 1718, adopted way back on October 14, 2006. This resolution specifically forbids the exporting of items, materials, equipment, goods, and technology determined by the Security Council or the Committee which could contribute to the DPRK's nuclear-related, ballistic missile-related, or other weapons of mass destruction-related programs. Now, Russia signed on to this resolution back in 2006, and it wouldn't have passed the Security Council without Russia's active support, right? As a member of the P5, they all have the right to veto. And now, 17 years later, we see this. Has Russia said anything about that contradiction there at all?
Well, from our perspective, obviously, when you've got the leader of Russia talking about potentially helping North Korea launch satellites, this does seem like a very blatant, upcoming violation of UN sanctions. But I think
I should point out he was also leader when that resolution, that United Nations Security Council resolution, was passed in 2006. So it's the same leader.
But, I don't think Russia is going to, even if there are any violations of UN Security Council sanctions, I don't think they're going to admit it. They're going to try and justify helping North Korea in any way it can because, as you said, Russia signed on to these resolutions. If it just goes around saying, yeah, we violated them and we're proud of it, it really undermines its own role on the UN Security Council. For instance, with the North Korean satellite launches, Russia might say, well, we'll help launch the North Korean satellite using our own rockets. And so therefore, we're not contributing to North Korean ballistic missile development. Now, whether you agree with that interpretation or not, it does seem like something Russia could say, we'll get the satellite up. And then once it's up, North Korea can do whatever it wants with it. And, interestingly, it kind of comes full circle because when Vladimir Putin, he first visited North Korea for his first summit shortly after becoming Russian leader around 20 years ago, there was actually discussion, if we cast our minds back, North Korea at that time hadn't developed the ability to launch a missile all the way over to the US. It was still working toward that goal. And there was some discussion about, well, if we offer to launch North Korea's satellites for it, then we're taking away North Korea's opportunity to practice its ballistic missile-related technology. And so therefore, we might not like its satellites, but at least, we're stopping the rocket development. So, there might be that kind of argument going on now as well behind the scenes. If Russia offers to launch North Korea's satellites for it, North Korea hasn't, it does seem to be able to hit the US now, but there's obviously more elements of its missile program it could perfect. If Russia launches North Korean satellites for it using its own rockets, it might take away that opportunity to improve its capabilities even more.
Okay. Any thoughts on the more recent visit by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Pyongyang to meet with both Kim Jong-un and Foreign Minister Choi Son-hee? I mean, the details seemed kind of scant to me. There were certainly photographs to highlight the optics of it, but the state media only offered a brief report saying that Kim Jong-un's established a long-term plan for a new era of stable and future-oriented U.S.-Russia DPRK relations, which, it's a very bromide statement. It doesn't say anything at all, very anodyne.
Right, I think the visit of Russia's defense minister,
Mr.
Shoigu, was more significant in the sense that there was a lot of North Korean state media coverage about that visit, right?
There was, yeah.
And then
including footage.
Yes.
Not just photos. Yeah.
No, footage, photos, everything.
The whole thing, yeah.
And I'm not sure. It's perhaps the Lavrov meeting was more about detailed discussions, less so about sending a message to the world, actually going into more concrete aspects of the cooperation between North Korea and Russia, which really seems to be thriving at this point.
Mm-hmm. He stayed for about 24 hours. He also went and laid a wreath or two at the memorial in Pyongyang for the Russian army or the Soviet army that helped liberate Korea in the Second World War. So it's Lavrov's a busy man as the foreign minister of a country that's at war with Ukraine. So to spend a whole day there, something of substance must have been talked about, but hasn't been released. So it might be something that we only learn about it after the fact, like we'll see an increase in bilateral trade or an influx of new North Korean workers to Russia later this year or in spring next year, and then just assume, sort of working backwards, this may be a result of those agreements, right?
Even yesterday we had a story talking about a governor in this far eastern region in Russia potentially giving farmland to North Koreans to use, and talking about a delegation from, I think it's called Primorsky Krai. Excuse me, Anton.
Primorsky Krai, over on the far east of Russia. Not great farmland in the winter, though.
Yeah, I guess beggars can't be choosers.
No, okay.
They'll take maybe what they can get. But yeah, part of this story was that a delegation from this region could potentially go and visit North Korea too. And I think he was talking also about like doing things like having people from that region vacation in North Korea and things like that. So
going back to the 1930s with Russians vacationing in North Korea.
We might be seeing lots more of these kinds of visits.
So I think slow regional cooperation is definitely increasing on a lot. Like the speed is picking up.
Yeah.
And especially that's also facilitated by these high-level visits right now. So the bordering region, Russian region to North Korea, definitely sees a lot of opportunities. And this is also a region that economically has some difficulties because it's so far from the center. And underpopulated. They're desperate for people to work in construction, for example.
Right.
And those are areas that North Korea can deliver for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in a lot of ways, it just makes sense, regardless of the UN sanctions, basically.
Well, and that brings us very naturally to our next theme. Alannah, as Deputy Managing Editor, read more stories than anybody writes in 1 month.
Allegedly.
Could become your nickname. Allegedly, Alannah. Now, what theme have you been gripped by in the last few weeks?
Yeah, so we've been covering a lot of this UN panel of experts reports, and some of the things that we've been covering from this report is covering overseas workers. So North Koreans working in different countries and sending their wages essentially back to North Korea. So it was a couple of instances. One in particular was some Korean restaurant workers in Laos. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly for our
it's either Laos or Laos
listeners.
Gordon Flake might be listening. He speaks Laotian, so he'll probably write us an email or send me a text to let me know whether it's Laos or Lao.
Forgive me, Gordon. So there was that instance. We had a story, Ifan, actually you wrote about some construction workers in Russia, and then also, no surprise, lots of IT workers around the world. So,
well, start off with these two intrepid North Korean restaurateurs in Laos who were doing not the obvious thing, but they were actually running a restaurant that wasn't a Korean restaurant.
No, so it was supposed to be a Japanese restaurant serving sushi and teppanyaki.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, when the Laotian government responded to these claims, they said that the restaurant had since been transferred ownership, but was still serving Korean food. So there was a bit of a discrepancy there that I thought was interesting.
Right.
I imagine patrons are quite disappointed if they're going for sushi and maybe not getting what they hoped for.
Well, or if they're going for bulgogi and being served sushi instead.
Yeah. And then also this report had kind of mentioned that they were supposed to be running this restaurant, but were also aiding IT workers in the country.
Okay, so that's restaurateurs and IT workers working together in Laos to... Well, I mean, I guess that's probably a common thing, right? I mean, in Holland, there are always those stories about the plethora of ice cream shops or Nutella pancake shops in Amsterdam that are allegedly money laundering fronts, right? They're cash businesses, so they work together with another business, and then a lot of cash gets through.
Exactly. Those are those mysterious shops that somehow don't have any customers, but still open. Are in the prime location of Amsterdam.
Right.
That's my theory about the dress shops in Itaewon.
Say more.
I think that they could be a cover for something, because why are there so many? And why are they always empty? But this is a story for a different day, Jacko.
It is, but I'm intrigued now. Can we... Actually, Alannah, as the deputy managing editor, can we start off a separate podcast just on the dress stores of Itaewon? I think
I'm totally up for that.
That may actually get quite a listenership going on. Now, I can't imagine that Laos is expected to be a lucrative place for North Korea to make money running restaurants. After all, it's a communist country still, and it's classified by the World Bank as a lower middle income developing country. So I was fascinated to see in the story that there's as many as 4 restaurants and a night market that employ North Korean workers. It's really an interesting focus of resources if there is nothing shady going on.
Well, I think that's exactly what Alannah already mentioned, that maybe there's more to it than just serving food, right?
Right.
And that's the most likely explanation because, as you said, running even 4 restaurants in Laos will definitely not fund this, nuclear weapons program.
Right. Now, in China, I mean, where there used to be, I don't know how many there are now, but there used to be quite a lot of restaurants in China. When I went to Shanghai in 2015, I think there were as many as 4 or 5 different North Korean restaurants. And there it makes some sense because the waitresses can sing and do these floor shows in Chinese, which brings in the nostalgic crowd of people who have nostalgic ideas about the Cultural Revolution, for example, or about the days under Mao. And so they like to see the kind of thing. But whether that strikes a chord in Laos or whether the girls there are trained to sing in Laotian, that's another question.
Mm-hmm. I think also in this report it talks about these IT workers that are numbering up to 10,000. So while it might...
In Laos alone?
No, across the world.
Yeah.
But so while it might be only maybe a smaller number in Laos, if you're looking at this across the broader context of the entire globe, it adds up.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to a question that I've long had is, how many North Korean IT workers are there? So we've got a ballpark figure now of 10,000.
So this UN report said as many as 10,000. Yeah, and earning like as much as 3,000 to 5,000 a month. And then
Each?
And then it said some of the highly skilled workers can earn as much as $20,000 a month.
Right. Does it say in which countries these workers may or may not be located?
It didn't specifically mention countries, I believe.
Because 10,000 is a lot, right? I mean, if you lived in a village and suddenly there were a workshop of North Korean IT workers there, you'd notice that.
I think I would imagine too, and we've talked about this before, they might not be purporting themselves as North Koreans. They could be saying they're from other countries and...
Right. Now, turning back to Russia, which we sort of already hinted at this earlier, that there's a need for construction workers in Russia, certainly in the Far East. Now, there was also mentioned in the panel of experts, some North Koreans who were injured while working on a new apartment building back in 2020 in Sakhalin, the island on the Far East of Russia, and they fell 6 and 7 floors.
Yeah, they're very seriously injured, yeah.
Right. And Russia said to the panel of experts that they were not construction workers, but they were, in fact, students on, quote, an industrial work experience course as part of their studies at Sakhalin State University, federally funded institution of higher education. So that's an interesting story, which means if it's true, if they are in fact students, that they couldn't have been making money, because otherwise it would have been a breach of United Nations Security Council's Resolution 2375 and 2397, both passed in 2017, which calls for North Korean labourers who are working overseas to be sent home and no new visas to be issued. So certainly by 2020, there shouldn't have been any North Koreans working in construction in Russia.
Right, so... James.
I was going to say case closed then. I mean, thank goodness they're on... that's going to be the suspicion, though, isn't it? That Russia knows that it would be a violation of UNSC sanctions to employ North Korean workers, and so... Perhaps, according to those who are more suspicious of Moscow's intentions, they could be using different types of visas to hire these workers. It's still, compared to before the COVID-19 pandemic, it still seems like low numbers of North Koreans entering Russia overall at the moment. I think suspicions are only going to grow once we get a hold of more data, and it seems that thousands of students on work experiences visas, just, if they just happen to show up at construction sites in the near future.
So, just to touch on what James mentioned there about different types of visas, since that UN sanction was brought in 2019, Russia has cut down on issuing work visas.
2017.
But the overseas labourers was enacted to 2019.
It wasn't until 2019.
Well, they had in 2017 they said no more new visas, and then they had a thing by the end of 2019 everyone gets sent home.
Exactly.
Yeah. So they did cut down on issuing those types of visas, And then we saw an increase in other types of visas. So, you know,
Right.
tourist visas, student visas, those kinds of things.
So one of the things after I read this about these two North Koreans who fell and apparently got really seriously injured is I reached out to a recent defector who actually worked in Russia until last year. And he told me that this is they were might have been on student visas, maybe even been connected to the university indeed, but they were most definitely working for money.
He had an interesting point about their age as well. What did he say?
Oh, that they're I think I read in the story that they were all over 30.
No, so this particular defector told me that if there are North Koreans over 30 on student visas in Russia, they're most likely to be not actual students, but working in construction for money. Yeah.
I mean, it would be not that hard to find someone at that university and say, have you ever seen any North Korean students in the class here, right? I mean, either they're going to class or they're not.
Yeah.
And they're spending all their time on the work site getting industrial training. Now, listeners, if you haven't yet heard episode 304 of the NK News podcast, in which I talked to the former chair of the UN panel of experts, Eric Penton-Vogt, about the difficulties of proving allegations and the internecine bickering between the different members states of the POE, do go back and have a listen to episode 304. And so, back on the visa issue, Russia's ambassador to North Korea, Alexander Matsugora, stated that not a single North Korean with a valid work visa was still in Russia in early 2020. So, if there are North Koreans and they're doing work, it must be on some other kind of visa, very clear. All right, Yifeng, you just mentioned a Defector. You write a lot about human rights and North Korean refugees. What's the latest on North Korean escapees that you want to talk about?
Well, I think it's always worth mentioning the quarterly a number of defectors that enter South Korea. So the Ministry of Unification here in Seoul every quarter releases statistics on how many defectors have entered South Korea, how many North Koreans have come to South Korea to settle here, and then also breaks that down in gender. So in the third quarter of 2023, we've seen 40 North Korean defectors arriving between July and September, that is, bring the total to 139 in the whole year. And that is definitely an increase. So we're slowly seeing more defectors entering South Korea.
Right. But before the pandemic, it was still over 1,000, wasn't it?
Right. It's still incomparable to pre-pandemic numbers for sure. That's always interesting to see. But at the same time, the Unification Ministry said in a press release that many factors affect these defector numbers. So it's difficult to speak of a trend yet. But I spoke to Hannah Song of the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, an organization that interviews a lot of recent defectors as part of their efforts to record human rights violations. And she said that many of the recent arrivals have come from China and spent a lot of years in China. Right. So they're not necessarily coming straight from North Korea. Most likely they've stayed in third countries for a long time.
And did she say anything about what motivates these North Korean refugees to finally make the move away from China and make the arduous journey to South Korea or another place?
Well, she told me that, for example, she told me the story of one woman who tried to defect pre-COVID-19 but wasn't able to. But now, even in China, pandemic restrictions have been lifted most of the places, so it's getting relatively easier to move a bit more freely. So I guess that could explain a slight jump.
Yeah.
Well, of course, the repatriations as well. A lot of defectors that have been in China for a long time are going to be, they might have been prompted by the news of the repatriations, China's forced repatriations of North Korean escapees, and thought, it's now or never. I either need to make the jump to South Korea now, or I risk being sent back now that the borders are open.
And sent back potentially to countries that they haven't known. Yifeng, you covered a story about a woman who had been in China since she was a young girl, and her family was concerned about her being sent back and not even being able to speak Korean anymore.
Right. So this is the very sad story of Kim Chol M, and she was repatriated after 25 years in China.
Wow.
So
her whole life, basically.
Yes, and I spoke to family members of her who are extremely worried about her safety and actually have no idea where she is right now. All they know is that on October 9th, she was repatriated from a Chinese prison to North Korea. And yeah, this person has lived more of her life in China than in North Korea.
Yep.
Doesn't even speak Korean well, from what her family members have told me. And these are the kind of people who are being sent back right now. And she was actually trafficked in China. She entered China when she was 14, right? Undocumented, sold to a Chinese man. Somehow made a life there and got children, got a daughter, and now is just being sent back just because she was unlucky to be caught,
right,
and without any documentation.
You also wrote recently, and I think we've talked on this podcast recently, about another North Korean woman named Kim Son-hyung, who was specifically named in a report to the UN Working Group to try to prevent her from being sent back. Do you have any updates on what's happened there?
No. There's simply no updates. So basically, it's completely unclear where the North Koreans who have been repatriated are right now. So we do know from family members that a considerable number of North Koreans who are in Chinese prisons have been sent back forcibly to North Korea.
Right.
And after that, we just don't know what's happening. We don't know where they are. Presumably, they're going through some kind of interrogation, likely in camps under really, really awful conditions. So it's actually really difficult to speak with these family members also as a journalist, because it's such a painful story. They're desperate to know where their family members are. Yeah, that's definitely very heavy stuff to work on. Yeah.
What's it like for you as an editor, Alannah, with these stories coming across your desk?
Yeah, I mean, just on a personal level, it's so sad. And so I can't imagine knowing that there's almost this timeline, that time is ticking. Because as Yifang said, once they're back in North Korea, we don't really know. It's very hard to find out what happens, to contact them, to hear, what's happening. So, for these families that are just desperate to stop their loved ones being repatriated, I just can't even imagine that time ticking down before they're potentially gone forever,
Yeah, wow. Now, as well as the an uptick in North Korean refugees coming through China and Southeast Asia, which is a very long journey, we've also had some stories recently, which I've talked about briefly with Jongmin earlier in the podcast, about boat crossings. We have an uptick in boats coming across both the West Sea and the East Sea, people taking a boat, borrowing a boat, stealing a boat, buying a boat, I don't know, and then coming across in small groups. What have you noticed about that, Yifang?
I mean, it's honestly too early to speak of a trend. We're talking about maybe 2-3 boats this year, something like that.
Right. And they've never been in big numbers in any year, right? Boat numbers have always been less than those coming through the China route.
Definitely, yeah. But it's interesting. It's definitely something I'm keeping an eye out on, because both the National Intelligence Service, the South Korean spy agency, and the Ministry of Unification have sort of predicted that there could be an increase, because during the pandemic, both North Korea and China have really, really increased the fences, for example, and the electronic monitoring of the border.
Yeah.
So it's getting more and more difficult to cross the China side.
Right.
So, yeah, it could definitely happen in the future that we will see more of this. But it's very dangerous and very, very difficult to undertake such a journey.
How long do you think it takes?
Good question. I mean, it depends on how far away from the South Korean border these boats depart. And these are small wooden boats.
So it's depending also on the amount of fuel that you've got and how strong the motor is. Because if these are, in some cases, small fishing boats, they may not be made for or equipped with a motor for deep sea travel. They're just sort of supposed to be puttering around the coastal area. And they may not have enough fuel to go very long distances. So then they're basically left adrift and hope that they drift to the right side of the border, the side that they want to go to. There has been, of course, some controversy on the South Korean side about the South Korean Navy or Coast Guard not being fast enough to detect and pick up these boats, right?
Yes, there was some controversy there, because these are really small wooden boats. At the same time, the South Korean public expects their Navy and their Coast Guard to spot these boats as soon as possible,
right?
Because of the risk of infiltrators, for example.
Yep.
So it apparently took a while for these boats to be detected. At the same time, I think I can understand that there is some critique, but if this was a real threat to national security in the form of a military boat, I think definitely there would be a better chance of detecting these kind of ships.
Now, speaking of boats, there was a case a few years ago of some sailors or fishermen in a boat that came south of the northern limit line. But most of them ended up dead. 2 of them, I think, were still alive, and they were handed back to North Korea via Panmunjom. And that's one that human rights and South Korean conservatives have criticized, the repatriation of these men. Is this still an ongoing issue?
Definitely. It's definitely still a very controversial issue. I'm not quite sure on the latest on the court case. Are you up to date with that, James?
I think not on the court case in particular, but South Korea, the current administration is trying to make it much more difficult for South Korea to send North Koreans who say that they want to defect back to North Korea. That wouldn't happen under the current administration, probably because they've taken a much firmer stance toward North Korea and on North Korean human rights than the previous administration. But I think they want to get the rules in place now so that future administrations that might not be quite on the same line of thinking on this issue as the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, that they can't do this in the future.
Yeah, now we don't. Well, I don't recall seeing any news about what's happened to those men since their repatriation, but I can't imagine it was anything good. I mean, they did confess to killing their officers, and I can't remember if they threw them overboard or left their bodies on the boat, but they did confess to murder, so I don't think anything good has happened to them up north. That's pretty much a foregone conclusion. Okay, well, we have a few minutes left. So what are the things that you're looking for in the next month and a half before the end of the year? What's something predicting or speculating what might happen before December 31st? Each of you come up with an idea.
A ladies first, if I may. Well, we were supposed to have a satellite launch in October. There's been 2 failed satellite launches already this year. Am I right in saying that? And so North Korea had promised that we were going to have a satellite launch in October, which of course didn't happen. So perhaps a satellite launch by the end of the year, maybe?
Okay, all right. They've still got a little bit of time left, particularly with whatever tech they may have been receiving from Russia, or time to hand over a satellite to Russia and have them launch it for North Korea. Yep. Yifeng, thoughts on what to see?
Yeah, I'm definitely curious whether we'll see another big large-scale repatriation from China, because since the one that happened on October 9th, there has been so much international pressure on China to stop doing this, including from the South Korean government. So I'm really curious to see if they're sympathetic to that criticism at all, or whether they're just going to go on and do what they've been doing. So that's one thing that I'm keeping a close eye on for sure.
Do we have any precedents where China in the past has decided against sending some people back?
Not that I know of. As far as I know, it's simply China's policy, because it regards North Koreans who live undocumented in China as illegal immigrants, to just send them back. Yeah. So I'm really curious to see what's going to happen now, because supposedly there are hundreds, potentially more than 1,000 North Koreans still detained in Chinese prisons.
Wow.
So yeah, before the end of the year, I'm really curious to see what will happen there. At the same time, yeah, I'm not very, very positive when it comes to that. I'm afraid that we'll see another large-scale repatriation.
That is unfortunate. Okay, and James, what are you looking forward to before the end of the year?
Well, we're still looking out for Vladimir Putin's visit to Pyongyang at some point. We don't know when that some point will be. It was, reported that during Kim Jong-un's visit to Russia that he accepted an invitation to hop over to North Korea at some point. Maybe Sergei Lavrov's visit in October to North Korea, maybe that was part of some kind of preparations for the Russian leader's visit to North Korea. We don't know. And this would be, if it does happen, it would be his first trip to the country in over 20 years. So it'd be a really big deal, massive repercussions, not only for Eastern Europe, of course, and the weapons transfers that are allegedly occurring, but also what might come from Russia-North Korea cooperation and how that might affect security on the Korean Peninsula.
Adding to that, I think I'm very curious to see if we will see these KN-23 short-range ballistic missiles deployed in Ukraine by Russia, because that would presumably be the next step of Russia-North Korea arms cooperation. And yeah, maybe just on a side note, one of the things that surprised me a little bit with so much happening in the world right now with the conflict in Israel, for example, how little upheaval there is, at least in European media, when it comes to these North Korea, Russia shipments. I don't know. For some reason, I thought there would be way much more controversy, way many more headlines about it. Of course, we've been reporting on it a lot, but now that we've actually see more and more evidence of it happening, it just feels a bit underwhelming.
And it does really have big implications for the war, not necessarily because North Korea is more technically advanced than Russia. But, a big part of this war is, a huge amount of ammunition is being used.
Yep.
And if Russia just gets something to fire at the Ukrainians just to keep them going, I mean, remember, support seems to be waning for Ukraine in certain parts of the Western world. And, if Russia can keep going just that little bit longer, thanks to North Korean aid, then maybe at some point Ukraine's supporters might lose a bit of appetite and will be forced to the negotiation table, which is something that Kiev really doesn't want to do.
Well, in response to James's prediction that Putin might visit Pyongyang, I'd like to cast our minds back to a couple of months ago when I had Andrei Lankov on the show, who suggested that Kim Jong-un might want to be visiting Beijing around this time to reaffirm his closeness with and support for China's President Xi Jinping, that China doesn't like to be left out of the picture too much, and all this focus on Russia, North Korea, with these 3 state visits, that it may be time for Kim to go and show some loyalty to Beijing, who is, after all, his closest alliance partner. You were going to say, Yifan?
No, I think you're absolutely right, because China is, after all, the biggest trade partner still.
That's right.
But yeah, one thing, going back to the weapons shipments, I read a lot of Dutch news. I'm from the Netherlands, but one tendency that I spot a lot is people do kind of underestimate North Korean weapons, I think. A lot of the things you read in especially European media on these shipments is that Russia is so desperate that it'll get some junk from the DPRK, right? But we follow North Korea very closely,
right,
and we do know that North Korean weapons can definitely be very advanced, right? So it would be very dangerous, I think, at least, to underestimate this cooperation between Russia and North Korea, which can potentially have huge implications also for Europe.
That's a very good point, and definitely something that we should keep an eye on in the future. Well, thank you all once again, Alannah, Yifang, and James, for coming on the Roundtable podcast for November. Great work, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacko.
And don't forget, everybody, get busy living or get busy dying. Let me ask you this. You're listening to the NK News podcast, so you know more about North Korea than most. But how about the South? To really understand what's happening on the peninsula, you need to know about South Korea. And now you can, through our new Korea Pro news and analysis service. This is not your average news service. It's a thoroughly researched analysis of South Korea's politics, society, and economy from an international perspective. But you know what the cherry on top is? The absolute lack of commercial influences. No ads, no sponsored articles. It's just pure, objective analysis by a team of qualified specialists. And the best part? As a listener of this podcast, you get a 25% discount. All you have to do is use the coupon code PODCAST during your sign-up. So head over to koreapro.org/podcast and start your journey with Korea Pro. That's koreapro.org/podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alannah Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.